Well, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate your being a part of this. My name is Eric Buer. I'm the founder and president of Gateways to Better Education. We help public schools understand how to promote religious freedom among their staff and their students, all within constitutional boundaries, and how to teach about the Bible and Christianity as it relates to their academic topics. And so, obviously, a holiday coming up, Easter. How can you appropriately teach about Easter? That's what we're going to be taking a look at today. So I hope you come away with some really good insights. You know, one of the things that I want to start with is pointing out that this is about teaching about Easter. This is not a Sunday school lesson. This is not trying to convert your children to believe the story. This is not about proving the story is true, nor is it about questioning whether the story is true. This is simply explaining the story and why it has such an impact on so many people throughout history and how it's impacted culture, art, literature, social movements, all kinds of things. But understanding that story is so important. So let's take a look at it, because I think one of the key things people often think of is, well, okay, if I'm going to teach about Easter, can I teach about the death and resurrection of Jesus? Can you read the biblical story, actually reading the Bible? And what about students who are not Christians? Are they going to feel not welcome? We've got some good questions that have come in, by the way, and I'll be addressing those as we go along. I can start out with the very first one. Carlene from South Carolina has asked a question: can I hand out a tract? Can I hand out a gospel tract? The short answer is no, you can't. This is not about proselytizing. This is not about evangelizing your students. This is about helping them understand the story and its impact on culture and history and people, and what this holiday is that's going on all around the world, and especially here in America. Well, let's take a look. Let's start with what some state standards say about the opportunity to teach about Easter. We've got one teacher here in California, Ramona, who's asked this question. I teach 7th grade English language arts, so how would I incorporate it in my curriculum? Well, here's a good example of where you can incorporate it in the curriculum. Your 7th grade students in California were supposed to have learned this in their 6th grade classes. And it says, and this is quoting, students are to note the origins of Christianity and the Jewish messianic prophecies, the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth as described in the New Testament, and the contribution of St. Paul the Apostle to the definition and spread of Christian beliefs. Then California's Department of Education actually puts in examples: belief in the Trinity, resurrection, and salvation. So if you're a 6th grade teacher, or for Ramona's sake, if you're a 7th grade teacher, students have already supposed to have learned this. Literally, the California Department of Education wants students to learn about the resurrection of Jesus. Believe it or not. Here it is in 7th grade in their academic framework, which is a little different than the standards, but it's a narrative that says, here's what we think is important in this grade level. Through selections from biblical literature, students will learn about those teachings of Jesus that advocate compassion, justice, and love for others. He taught that God loved all his creation regardless of status or circumstance, and that humans should reflect that love in relations with one another. Jesus shared the Jewish belief in one God, but he added the promise of eternal salvation to those who believe in him as their Savior. So again, first of all, let's start out with the very first phrase of that paragraph. Through selections from biblical literature. 7th grade students are supposed to be reading biblical literature, according to the California Department of Education. And they're supposed to be learning about what Jesus said about belief in him as their Savior. Well, that's the Easter story right there. So California, you definitely can teach about it. And we're taking a look at various state academic standards. We do research. Our team does research on every state's academic standards where the Bible and Christianity can be included appropriately. And if you would like a copy of your state's academic standards, then you can just go onto our website. A pop-up will happen when you first log in, And you can then just fill out a form and we will mail you our research on your state's academic standards as it relates to the Bible and Christianity. But people who have joined the call, I rated them by the numbers who have come in. California was number one, so that's why we led with the California standards. Next one is Florida. So let's take a look at what Florida has to say about teaching about Easter. Well, in their 6th grade social studies, it says, identify key figures and the basic beliefs of Christianity and how these beliefs impacted the Roman Empire. Examples are Christian monotheism, Jesus as the Son of God, Peter, and Paul. So you can't understand the basic beliefs of Christianity without understanding the Easter story. And what I recommend is, if you're going to be teaching this in a class, you put this standard right at the bottom of the page, or you put it on the board. You say, this is why I'm teaching this, because our state expects you to understand these things. Here's another one from Florida. In 10th grade, English language arts, they're to analyze how mythical, classical, or religious texts have been adapted. The classical source text for this benchmark should be from ancient Greece or Rome's classical period. Mythical texts from this benchmark can be from any civilization's early history. Religious texts for this benchmark include works such as the Bible. So again, teaching students the Easter story right out of the Bible is perfectly acceptable to do in Florida. Next, we've got a good group of folks represented from Texas. Well, Texas passed a law that says there's required curriculum. And this is interesting. Each school district that offers kindergarten through grade 12 shall offer as required curriculum, and then they list math, science, reading, so forth. And then they say in point number 2, they are required to have enrichment curriculum. And that includes religious literature, including the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, and the New Testament, and its impact on history and literature. So again, by Texas law, schools and teachers are to teach about the impact of Christianity in the Bible in history and literature, and it's part of their enrichment. They also have an academic standard that says this: the student understands the history and relevance of major religious and philosophical traditions. The student is expected to, not optional, is expected to describe the historical origins and central ideas in the development of monotheism, describe the historical origins and central ideas and spread of major religious and philosophical traditions. And then it lists various religions, including Buddhism and then Christianity. What I find oftentimes, though, is teachers have no problem teaching about other religions because that's multicultural. But teaching about Christianity, well, that might be a violation of the separation of church and state. Again, you're expected to teach it in Texas. Next group, Virginia. We've got a good representation from Virginia on the call. So in grade 9, world history, the student will apply history and social science skills to understand Rome and the Byzantine Empire by describing the origins, beliefs, customs, and spread of Christianity, including persecution and eventual adoption and transmission of Christianity, the New Testament, and it lists some more things. So they're supposed to read the New Testament. They're supposed to understand the origins and beliefs of Christianity. And again, teaching about Easter and the resurrection story is acceptable. In grade 10, the student will apply history and social science skills to analyze the political, cultural, geographic, and economic conditions in the world around 1500 AD by describing the beliefs, sacred writings, traditions, customs, and growth of major religions, including but not limited to, and it lists Christianity among the other religions. So again, perfectly acceptable, and in fact, academically expected to teach about these things. Remember, though, it's important that it is instructional, not devotional. You're not trying to lead students to become Christians. You're trying to help them understand the story. And I recommend that you explain by attribution. By that, I mean, you attribute it to the source. Hey, Christians believe that Jesus died for their sins and rose from the grave. And here's the story. Or the Bible records that. Or in the story, God said, or in the story, Jesus did this. Now you're attributing it to the source. And kind of the key question is, could a non-Christian say it? They might not believe it, they might not want to say it, but could they agree? Well, yes, Christians do believe this, and the Bible does record this, or in the story, it does say this. So by teaching by attribution, you're attributing to the source. That's a really good way to teach fully about the story, but not get immersed in that you're trying to convert students and be accused of somehow proselytizing. Think of it as a fence. Everything inside this yard, in this fenced yard, is allowable. But if you go outside the fence, it's not allowable. So Easter is, okay? Easter is a time when Christians celebrate the death and resurrection of Christ. Christians believe that he died and rose from the grave to pay the penalty for our sin. Christianity has impacted civilization in these ways. Christians in history have done this and done this and done this. It's a good example of how it's impacted, that story has impacted the world. What you can't say, what is outside the boundary, is you should believe, or this is the way, or Christianity is better than other religions, not showing preference like that. Oftentimes a question comes up, well, do I have to give equal time? And if I have to give equal time to all religions and all their holidays, I don't have time for that. I just don't have the bandwidth. So that's my reason why I'm not going to address it at all. And this comes from our understanding of fairness. The idea is that fairness means all religions must be given equal time in the classroom. That seems fair. Actually, there's another way to look at something that's fair, and that is proportional. The appropriate assumption is sometimes fairness means proportional, not equal. What are some examples of that? Well, for example, in our legislation, in our legislatures, in Congress, we have every state gets 2 senators. Doesn't matter how big you are, how small your state is, you get 2. That's fair, means equal. But in the House of Representatives, it's fair means proportional to your population. So Texas, California, New York get a lot more representation than Connecticut and Rhode Island. Another example where proportional is fair is in teachers' pay. You know, I could be a new teacher right out of the gate, and I teach the same number of students, the same subject, I grade the same number of papers. I don't get equal pay for equal work. I get paid proportional to my years of service. And everybody but the rookie calls that fair. And then the other is buffet lines. I could be a 300-pound linebacker, and my wife could be a supermodel that's 120 pounds. And we pay the same price for the buffet, but I'm going to eat a lot more than she is. And that's considered fair because it's proportional to your capacity. So when it comes to holidays, it's looking at the proportionality of its impact on the culture, on your community, and even on your classroom. And you want students to understand their classmates. You want students to understand the community they live in, but you also want them to understand the nation they live in. And so there's a proportionality there that is important, and you can take into account when you're thinking in terms of, well, I've got to teach all the religious holidays and I just don't have time. That's not the case. What about the problem of some students feeling left out? Well, no student should feel left out. Let me go back here. No student should feel left out. And you want to be able to help them understand the holiday, help them understand what this is about without making them feel like, well, it's not my holiday, so wow, I feel like an outlier. In fact, we've got one question that's come in from Sarah in Nevada. And she has said, what about discussing Passover as well? Because Passover happens around the same time. And I think that's a great opportunity to teach the impact of Passover. Now, you might say, well, how is that impactful? Not too many people in America celebrate Passover. Yes, the Jews do, but that's not the majority of the population. But Passover led to the Exodus, which led to the Mount Sinai, which led to the 10 Commandments, which has impacted Western civilization and, frankly, world civilization. And so talking about Passover is also really important when you help understand the context of the impact that Jewish people have had on the world and the Ten Commandments and Moses' teachings and so forth. So you don't want students to feel left out, but that doesn't mean that you shy away from teaching what the holiday is about. Let's take a look. We've created a lesson plan, and what we're going to do is follow up with this webinar. Everybody who's registered for the webinar will receive a PDF of a lesson that I wrote, and it's really a textbook style. It looks like a textbook, but it is the Easter story, Luke 22 through 24. And it talks about, it's basically a paraphrase of those chapters of the Bible. And in it, we've got key phrases that students are expected to learn, things like a Judas, the kiss of death, cross to bear, washing my hands of this, to be crucified, a doubting Thomas. These are all phrases that we use in our vernacular. And they come from this story. And so helping students understand that, and that's, we call that out. Throughout the lesson, you'll be able to see these call outs that explain where we get those phrases from. We also then do sidebars where we show the intersection with history and culture and art and so forth, like Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper that was painted up in Milan. Or the term Holy Grail refers to the myth of the cup or the plate used by Jesus during the Last Supper. And somehow it holds magical powers according to mythical tradition. And so again, just helps them understand the context of how this story has impacted culture. You also have things like Shakespeare, and here a reference to Judas in Shakespeare's King Richard II. Also, here's an example I circled in yellow for you. You might have heard the phrase, the kiss of death, and this is where the phrase comes from. Saying that something is the kiss of death means it is an action that brings ruin to someone or someone's plans. The term to be a Judas now refers to someone who delivers another person into the hands of an enemy. Those are commonly used phrases, and this is the story it comes from. On the next page, we highlight the social movements that it's impacted. For instance, the Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, referred to the crucifixion of Christ. Well, students can't understand the letter from a Birmingham jail unless they understand the references that Dr. King was making. And so he is referring to this story, and he says, in that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. So again, understanding the Easter story helps you understand the context of things like Reverend Martin Luther King's statements. Another example would be the Battle Hymn of the Republic. During the Civil War, there was a famous hymn called the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and it has a phrase in there that says, in the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free while God is marching on. Again, that whole theme and so much of the Civil War was motivated by this idea of righteousness and goodness, and here was a great example of it. And then a later version said, let us now live to make men free. Another is Tolkien. If you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, he uses a lot of biblical imagery. And in one of the scenes where Gandalf is defending his friends and he sacrifices himself and he dies, but then he comes back later to rescue them. And he's actually in white robes coming back to do that. And so it's a wonderful imagery that comes from the story of the death and resurrection of Christ. And then finally, there's the story of John Newton. And John Newton wrote arguably the most famous hymn ever sung, and that is Amazing Grace. See, he was a slave trader before he became a Christian. And when he heard the Christian story, the story of Christ's death and resurrection, he was moved, and he became a Christian and he eventually became a pastor. And he wrote this song and he talked about the amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Well, he was a wretch, he considered himself, because he was a slave trader. And so a wonderful impact on our music and on, of course, the issue of slavery. And then there are discussion questions at the end that help students understand the story. So these are the pages, and I encourage you to get a copy of it, and would be delighted to send that to you and encourage you to use it. You know, if you're a mom or a grandma or a parent, a grandparent, feel free to use this with your own kids, because they might know the story from going to Sunday school, but they might not know this, how it impacts civilization. And this could be a great way to teach them. If you're a teacher, I encourage you to use this in some way with your students as well. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to look at a couple other questions we have here. Is it okay to read an age-appropriate book about the real Easter story? Well, Carol, I think we've answered that question. The age-appropriate book would be Luke 22 through 24, the New Testament. You could use a children's book, a children's Bible if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend that you just open your Bible and read it. I would recommend finding it on the internet, copy and pasting it into a Word document, and printing it out and using it in that way, so it doesn't have that symbolism of somehow you're opening this holy book. But there's nothing wrong with actually reading from the Bible itself. Let's see, I was wondering how we can keep the students motivated and engaged during lessons being taught. Regina from North Carolina says, well, I think this can be a very engaging story. It's very dramatic. And as they understand this story, and we paraphrased it to put it into a language that takes out the these and the thous, and it makes it more accessible for students. And when they see the connection with things they might already know or hear about in culture, I think that can be a very engaging way. Again, I encourage you to do this in your classrooms and in your homes and in your churches. We're going to be following up, sending you this so that you can use it. Thank you so much for joining us.